A childhood marred by trauma tracing back to residential schools, social services that didn't provide supports, and pleas for help that fell on deaf ears. This new report on Tina Fontaine reveals just how tragic her short life was.
Everyone, you're listening to Creep It Real. I'm Ashley.
And I'm Bianca.
Thank you for listening to Creep It Real.
Hello and welcome back, and welcome to the family. Cammie from Michigan and Kathleen from Alabama. You guys are super incredible. You guys are amazing. You're beautiful, and we appreciate your love of the show so much.
Very much.
Our listeners and our patrons really do humble us each week that goes by as we take a look at our current downloads and trends, and just every week it gets better and better, and that's because of you.
While our mental health goes down, our show goes up.
Oh, fuck. And with that, we would like to also announce that soon we're going to be teaming up with some companies that we actually love in order to provide you guys with discounts, deals, and so on and so forth, so that we really can make this our Patreon our full-time jobs and provide you with all of the content. So just
like regular weekly episodes.
Yeah. Obviously, COVID is still out in full force, but the goal is, of course, to start traveling as well so that we can meet all of you when that is possible again. It has been spoken into the universe publicly now, so now we're really going to work as hard as possible, although we were already, so don't get it twisted. Also, if you are a fan of the show and haven't yet, feel free to mosey on over to iTunes and bless us with a 5-star review and just write a little something like awesome. It really does help the show out a lot, and we know that you hear that everywhere, but it really does.
Mm-hmm.
Following us on Spotify also helps us just as much as that, so feel free to do that if you love the show as well, and if you haven't. And finally, share the show with your family and friends, and if you tag us on your Instagram story or whatever, retweet us or anything, we'll show you on our stories as well. Small business owners, maybe we can help you get your products in front of other like-minded people as well, so keep that in mind. So here we go. Ashley started this show a couple years ago for a myriad of reasons, and this episode harkens to one of the main reasons that she cultivated a passion for true crime. It's a good thing that I'm talking for you, Ashley.
Yeah. I'll allow it.
Well, the reason I say that is because before I came onto the show, she had done an episode on Amber Tucaro and a few other indigenous women that I just did not write in here, so I apologize.
It's okay. I talk about it in a second.
But Amber was a 21-year-old Indigenous woman from Alberta, Canada, who went missing on a night that she was supposed to go out to the city. And I remember, as a listener, hearing the audio from her experience and literally how nauseous it made me as I was walking my dog. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP, did not take her disappearance seriously, and on September 1st, 2012, horseback riders ended up finding a partial skeletal remains on a farmer's field near Leduc County. I strongly suggest, if you haven't yet, to go back and listen to that episode as well. Although I know I just said it made me nauseous, I just think it's very important to listen to. I am nauseous just in recording this episode, so.
And Amber's story is still one, or her case is still unsolved to this day, even though there's audio of her murderer that we played on the show. And so I definitely recommend going back. It was one of the cases that I started the show for to begin with, for
right.
sure. Because I couldn't believe that there's audio of this man talking to her, and she clearly you can hear in her voice that she knows that she has gotten into the wrong vehicle.
Right.
And so, it's just somebody out there's got to recognize his voice. But anyway, I know that it's also kind of hard to cover this and not talk about a million other cases because there are so many cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, men as well. But today we're talking about women, and it really the case is just, when you talk about one, you have to mention 15 others because they're all in the same area. And so, there are some theories that there's a serial killer in the area. There have been serial killers in the area. And at this point, we don't really know what exactly is going on that's creating this, but we'll obviously talk about it. Oh, our sources for this episode include the incredibly detailed book, Red River Girl, The Life and Death of Tina Fontaine by Joanna Jolly. And a link to that, as well as all of our other sources, will be listed in the show notes. So, like Bianca said, we've talked about the disturbing amount of missing and murdered Indigenous people there are in both the United States and Canada in a couple of episodes, namely number 29, which was Amber Tukaro, and then number 33 was Heather Cameron Holler and Khadijah Britton. But clearly, I don't think we've covered it enough, as it's a very serious problem that has been going on for well over many decades, if not much, much longer. And there are lists that go on miles long of names. Mm-hmm.
I was looking at them too, and I was like, no, again, nauseous, because I don't know what about that just was nauseating to me.
It's not great.
It's not. The missing and murdered Indigenous women, MMIWG, epidemic affects Indigenous peoples in Canada and the U.S., like Ashley just said, including the First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Native American communities. It has been described as a Canadian national crisis and a Canadian genocide. A corresponding mass movement in the United States and Canada works to raise awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls through organized marches, community meetings, the building of databases, local city council meetings, tribal council meetings, and domestic violence trainings for police.
One of the most notorious murders is that of 19-year-old Helen Betty Osborne, who was originally from the Indigenous community of Norway House Cree Nation, but had moved to the Manitoba town of the Pas to go to secondary school because Norway House did not have one. Her parents said she intended to become a teacher. Tragically, it was there in the Pas that she would be found dead in the snow on the outskirts of town in 1971. One night while walking home, she was picked up by 4 young white men that were cruising the streets looking for a, quote, Indian girl to have sex with. They forced her into the car, drove to an isolated location, and raped and stabbed her more than 50 times with a screwdriver.
Oh my God, what?
Mm-hmm. It's actually the subject of an entire season of one of my favorite podcasts that I forget the name of now. It's one of my favorites, but I can't remember the name. But I think it's it doesn't matter. I'll put it in the show notes. Although the identity of all 4 men was an open secret in the PA, it took over 16 years before 3 of the men were charged with the murder, and in the end, only 1 was convicted, if you can fucking believe it.
Of course.
17 years later, after a Winnipeg police constable shot an Indigenous leader, J.J. Harper, dead in a case of mistaken identity, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba was established to investigate this and Osborne's killing. The commissioners spent a year visiting towns, cities, reserves, and jails to collect information on how the Indigenous community interacted with the police and the judicial system. Unsurprisingly, their findings were not great. In Helen Betty Osborne's case, it described a police culture rampant with racism, sexism, and indifference to the community they served, and operated in a community where it was the norm to treat Indigenous people with disregard. They concluded that the justice system as a whole had failed Manitoba's Indigenous population on a massive scale. It described how the white population in the PA had belittled and ignored their Indigenous neighbors, how there was talk in town that white men were throwing Indigenous men off a bridge into the Saskatchewan, into the Saskatchewan River, allegations that the town's all-white police force never took seriously enough to even investigate. The town's officers were criticized for routinely stopping and interrogating young Indigenous men on the streets, while simultaneously turning a blind eye when white men harassed Indigenous girls for sex. Even though the men would resort to violence and giving the girls alcohol in order to coerce them, the police never thought to question if the girls were being groomed or forced into sexual activity. When they investigated Osborne's murder, some of the officers had threatened and intimidated her Indigenous friends while taking the time to inform the parents of white suspects of their rights. The commission commented that, quote, this discriminatory conduct was probably so inbred that officers did not notice that their conduct displayed prejudice and discrimination. Ahem. I think this could be said for pretty much every police force. It found that the police behavior reflected a hierarchy established by Canada's early settlers, white men at the top, Indigenous men beneath them, and Indigenous women at the very bottom. Since Osborne's death, dozens of Indigenous women have been murdered in Manitoba alone. Sadly, even one of her cousins, 16-year-old Felicia Solomon Osborne, who told her mother one afternoon in 2003 that she thought a car had followed her as she walked home from her Winnipeg high school. A few weeks later, she disappeared, and her mother immediately knew something was wrong and called the police, who told her she needed to be missing for 24 hours before a search could start, which is bullshit, too. It would be 1 full week before police interviewed her and 2 months before they would issue a press release asking for help in finding Felicia. A month later, body parts began washing up along the Red River near the Alexander Docks, which we'll talk about today. And the police established the parts belonged to Felicia, but were unable to glean any information about how she died or who had murdered her. In the newspaper at the time, it was speculated that Felicia had been murdered and dismembered at 19 years old, by the way, because she was caught up with gangs and the sex trade, something that, one, there was no proof of, and is typical of the media to paint minorities with a different brush than white folks who have something happen to them like this. And in this situation, places the onus of her murder on her, which is absolutely incorrect, because regardless of what she was doing, she should not have been dismembered and murdered and dismembered.
There's no reason for somebody to be dismembered and murdered. And not only that, there's not really... you can't really blame that person for becoming dismembered and murdered.
No, but we love victim blaming.
Yep.
Then, 5 years later, Osborne's 21-year-old cousin, Claudette, also disappeared. She was last seen headed to a motel, the Lincoln Motor Hotel, on one of Winnipeg's inner-city highways, and she had just recently given birth to her 4th child only weeks earlier and had actually called a relative to say that she was being harassed by the man that she had just met, who was a long-distance truck driver from Calgary. So her relative said that Claudette was still bleeding from having the baby, and the truck driver was relentless in trying to rape her. She was calling her relatives at 4 a.m. asking for help. In a phone message she left, she was clearly terrified for her safety and said that the man was pushing himself on her, and she pled for someone to come and get her. But the phone that she was calling from ran out of credit, and it would be days before anyone in her family would get her message, which sounds very similar to the Amber Tukro story where she left a message for her brother at prison. And so they only heard that because the message was recorded. I don't really understand exactly. I can't remember exactly the exact details, but I know that it was a couple days before anybody even heard her phone call saying that she was being taken somewhere she didn't want to go. So anyway, in Claudette Osborne's case, her sister tried to file a report with the police, but she felt it was a struggle to get them to take any action. It would be almost a week before they would check security cameras in the hotel, and at that point, any video of that night was already taped over. But they did actually track down the truck driver. They couldn't find any evidence that put Claudette in his vehicle, and the police told Claudette's sister that she should just let the whole thing go because the man had a wife and kids, and the whole thing was just embarrassing for him.
Oh no. Yeah.
I'm literally cannot even believe this.
It's so embarrassing. It's fine.
Yes.
Your sister's dead.
He might have been the last person to see your sister, who might have been saying to all of you that he was trying to rape her, but it's no matter. He has no business in this situation. He's embarrassed that his wife is going to find out. Like, really? I don't understand the logic.
No, absolutely not.
Obviously, Claudette's sister was furious, and it really does not matter the man's embarrassment in the situation, as he put himself in it. They were treating it like he was the victim and not Claudette. And incredibly, yet another person from Helen Betty Osborne's extended family was killed. 18-year-old Hillary Wilson, who went missing from her Winnipeg home in August of 2009. A few weeks before her body would be discovered on a dirt path at the outskirts of the city, the body of her best friend, Raven Thundersky, had been discovered on farmland nearby. Raven Thundersky's sister had also been murdered, and before she was murdered, Raven was trying to raise awareness about violence against Indigenous women. The tragedy striking the Osborne family is not unique, though, as much as you might think it would be, because considering I just listed out 15 people practically who have all been murdered, it's not in any way unique. It's one small part of a huge, huge problem that is going on in Canada and the United States, like Bianca said earlier.
So the 2014 report, Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women, a National Operational Overview by the RCMP, found that more than 1,000 Indigenous women were murdered over a span of 30 years. While homicides for non-Indigenous women declined between 1980 and 2015, the number of Indigenous women who were victims of homicide increased from 9% of all female homicide victims in 1980 to 24% in 2015.
That's pretty significant.
From 2001 to 2015, the homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada was almost 6 times as high as the homicide rate for non-Indigenous women, representing 4.82 per 100,000 population versus 0.82 per 100,000 population. In Nunavut, Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and the provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, this overrepresentation of Indigenous women among homicide victims was even higher. In response to activists, the Canadian government funded data collection on missing and murdered women, ending in 2010. The Native Women's Association of Canada has documented 582 cases since the 1960s, with 39% after 2000. Nevertheless, advocacy groups say that many more women have been missing, with the highest number of cases in British Columbia.
So all of this means that while Indigenous women make up only 4% of Canada's population, they were 4 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than non-Native women. According to even the RCMP's lower figures, it meant that almost half of all women murdered were Indigenous, which is a seriously significant statistic. The RCMP figures also found that while 74% of non-Indigenous women murdered between 1980 and 2012 were killed by a partner or a close family member, Indigenous women, for Indigenous women, it was only 60%, meaning that they are at a greater risk to be killed by strangers or, quote, casual acquaintances, which is a term used often to describe the client-sex worker relationship. Indigenous women were being targeted by predators when they moved to and traveled to the cities and out of their immediate communities, which is not the same for non-Native women.
Notable cases have included 19 women killed in the Highway of Tears murders.
The Highway of Tears is the British Columbia's Highway 16, which is a remote road that stretches from Prince Rupert along the Pacific coast through forests and logging towns to the city of Prince George. Locals said the number of missing was close to 50 women, and most have never been solved.
And some of the 49 women from the Vancouver area were murdered by the infamous serial killer Robert Pickton.
Pickton was the pig farmer from Vancouver who is known to have killed, at the very least, 33 women, and he bragged that the number was closer to 50, the 49 that you just said. Over half his victims were Indigenous. The investigation took well over 5 years, and his farm was ever only raided, this sounds very familiar to a million other cases that we've talked about, due to an unrelated charge. In the end, he would be convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder, which is not anywhere near close to what he probably should be charged with.
In 2019, one of the most significant findings in the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in June was that there was no, quote, reliable estimate of the numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA. And that stands for, I don't know if you want me to go for that.
Go for it.
Okay. Ooh.
Go for it.
And that stands for Two-Spirited, which is a modern pan-Native umbrella term used by some Indigenous North Americans to describe Native people in their communities who fulfill a traditional third gender or gender variant, which is a ceremonial and social role in their cultures: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual. Because, sorry.
Well done.
I had never known about somebody
Really?
who was two-spirited.
Oh my
Never
God.
known.
That was like something that I remember thinking, this is just another one of those things where it's like, for as long as people have been around,
Yes.
there have been roles that aren't clearly defined, and to act as though that there's just that everything is binary and super black and white, because for some reason it became that in more modern times, everybody wants to make things black and white. It's like, it doesn't mean that that's not
right.
a legitimate thing.
Right. I mean, it's honestly, it's so beautiful. Like to have that's so beautiful.
Well, and to me, to acknowledge and recognize that in your own community, and be able to say, like, this is a valuable person in society who plays this role. It's nothing unusual. It's like, why did we have to stray so far? Why did we have to stray so far? It's because we took over and wanted to wipe every idea of their entire culture out of existence. And that, as we'll continue to talk about here.
So anyways, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about a lot of things within this episode. So I think that's why I'm having like this existential crisis where I'm like, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about that. Oh my God. These poor people. Anyways.
But it's also important to say, of course, like, they have been held down. Entire culture has been erased from them. But, I don't want to undermine the power that they do still have within their own communities and can, of course, put out into the world.
Sure. Yeah, of course. So because of these devastating statistics, Ashley and I both find it necessary to discuss a case that might be lesser known within the true crime community, and really a topic that we want to keep coming back to in order to lend a voice to those who may otherwise have less of a voice, just like we want to do with
all people of color. Indigenous women face very real obstacles like poverty, abuse, and lack of opportunities. These stem from a core issue of intrinsic racism. What's new? Side note, did you know that the Iroquois word for female genitalia, or more accurately, it was the equivalent to our word cunt, is squaw? So for generations, everyone has been referring to Indigenous women as cunts, essentially.
Right.
And I bet most of us had no idea whatsoever. I definitely had no idea that squaw was a word equivalent to the word cunt until I read the book I was reading. And I was like, wow, I did not know that. And that's just one small example of how, I don't know how to put it, but how the culture of the Indigenous culture has been taken by white people and just manipulated into and taken down to like the very base level that it is all. Anyway, I don't even know. We should probably just erase. I don't even know what to say. It's just like, I couldn't believe believe that there are things like that. Think about how many other things there are like that. Kidding. Like what am I not knowing here? So, okay. So we're going to start talking now about the case of Tina Fontaine, an Indigenous teenager who was murdered. And to do so, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the backstory about the area in which she lived. Mm-hmm. So Winnipeg, Canada owes its existence to the Red River, which winds and twists its way north through the Canadian prairies and cuts right through the city. Once a highway for European colonizers who came in search of fur, and a gathering place for the Indigenous peoples that they traded with. There were also rail lines that brought the city its wealth and immigrants, and the suburban gardens that make for such a lovely place for its residents to reside. And then there are the more complicated roles the river plays. There is waste polluting its waters, the homeless build shelters on its banks, and desperate people choose it as a place to die by suicide. The morning of August 17th, 2014, saw an unusual amount of activity as the police dive boats positioned under the metal trusses of the Canadian National Railway Bridge, and witnesses watched as police divers lowered themselves into the water one by one. They were searching for the body of a homeless local hero named Farron Hall, who had, 2 days prior, walked to the river's edge, taken off his clothes, and left them in a neat pile while he waded into the murky, warm water. Hall was, again, a homeless alcoholic who had gained national fame 5 years earlier when he rescued 2 separate people from the river. One was a teenage boy who slipped into the icy water, attempting to dodge traffic on a bridge, and a few months later, a lady fell in after hanging out and drinking at the river all day. Her boyfriend went in after her, but Hall quickly realized that they were both in trouble and jumped in to help. He saved the woman, but was unable to help her boyfriend, who died. It weighed heavily on his mind. He later told a local reporter, "The Red is an unforgiving river. It can take your life and spit you out." For his heroic actions, he was rewarded with a medal and money, some of which he donated to a local homeless shelter. Unfortunately, there are garbage humans out there, and he was beaten up one day after being recognized as the, quote, homeless hero. In another instance, he was publicly shamed because after saving 2 people's lives, the press reported he had been arrested for begging and for drinking. Hall was an Indigenous man who, like many others, experienced a tremendous amount of sadness and violence in his life. His mother had died young, his sister was fatally stabbed, and he personally struggled with addiction. After serving time for assault, he returned to living in a makeshift tent on the Red River bank, within eyesight of the Esplanade Real pedestrian bridge. The day he walked into the river, it wasn't clear if he was just trying to cool off, attempt another rescue, or if he was ending his life. Either way, he was seen thrashing in the strong current which swept him under the bridge. A water taxi rushed to his rescue, the pilot attempting to grab him. In an awful turn of events, that pilot then suffered a heart attack in the process of attempting to rescue Hall. What? I know, and had to be dispatched to the hospital. So by the following morning, the dive teams knew they were looking for a body and not a rescue.
What the fuck?
At the same time, the captain of the pleasure cruise boat, MS River Rouge, Alexander Cunningham, was returning to where he had moored his boat the night prior at the Alexander docks, a little over a half a mile from where Hall was last seen. Years prior, the propellers of his boat had dislodged a dead body that had been embedded in the muddy riverbed, and this morning he would watch as the action unfolded before him on the river. As it appeared, once again he had inadvertently done the same thing. 2 of the onlookers that day were Dwayne Oliver and his 10-year-old son, who had woken early to visit the Manitoba Museum, parking near the Alexander docks to do so. Though they were a little too eager, and when they arrived the museum wasn't open yet, they decided to head to the riverbank and find a good place that they could fish later that day. As they walked along the riverbank, they discussed the man the divers were searching for when Oliver spotted something unusual submerged halfway in the shallows of the river. He told his son to hang back and went to investigate what appeared to be the back of a human body slouched on its knees and wrapped in a tan blanket. His worst fears were confirmed when he smelled the putrid scent of rotting flesh and a swarm of black flies. They ran back to the dock, calling 911 while they did. Police arrived only a few minutes later, and the rescue dinghy being quickly launched into the river with a crew in wetsuits, followed by the police dive crews, who had abandoned their search for Farron Hall at this point and were on their way over to this body. They quickly spotted the large object that had become lodged in the long reeds on the bank. A crew member pulled the mast toward them as they drew near. At this point, it had become quite saturated and heavy, and it was quite a bit of a struggle to get it on board. Only once it had been safely secured on the boat, they were able to identify that it was in fact a dead body. And they knew it wasn't Hall, as even though the cloth used to wrap the body had been knotted at the top of the body, an arm had worked its way out, and a bruised-looking, not grown man arm was hanging out and had been exposed to the water. At 1:50 p.m., officers alerted the head of the Winnipeg Police Homicide Unit, 53-year-old Sergeant John O'Donovan, of the potential crime. As officers described the scene, he was struck by the details of the knots on the top of the bundle, as it was clearly not a case of suicide or accidental drowning, as I don't know how you would expect somebody to tie knots in a blanket after they committed suicide.
Commit suicide, yeah.
On his way to the Winnipeg Police Headquarters, O'Donovan coordinated his investigation, calling the forensic supervisor to get the details on age, sex, condition of the body, and to see if they could tell him how long it had been in the water. He called the street supervisor to get the details on the exact location the body had been found, asking if there were any cameras in the area that could have caught anything, witnesses in the area who may have seen something significant, and then to the sergeant in charge of the district to figure out what resources were available to seal off the area and interview any possible witnesses. The forensic supervisor he called was Constable Susan Roy Hagman, who was at the Alexander docks, arriving shortly after the rescue crew had gotten the body to the dock and covered it with a black tarp. She made 2 small incisions into the tarp to drain some of the water away, monitoring it to make sure no critical evidence would be lost as it ran out. She then took fingerprints, which were immediately emailed to her technicians to process. The results quickly came back with no match in the system. She realized that nothing more could be done on the dock and ordered the body be moved to St. Boniface Hospital for a more thorough examination. The forensic pathologist on duty was Dr. Dennis Ree, who had recently completed his residency in California. As he removed the cloth, he saw that it had been packed with multiple rocks, large and small, weighing around 25 pounds. Everything inside the cloth was covered in a thick layer of dark green river mud, but after closer inspection, Ree was able to see the material was embroidered with a leaf pattern on one side and had buttons and eyelets along the bottom edge. He ID'd it as a duvet cover and handed it over to the police forensics team for further analysis, which we will talk about this in detail later. It was now time to examine the body. He observed it was a small young female at around 5'3" and 73 pounds. He estimated it was a very young teenager. She wore a short-sleeved shirt that said "Born to Rock," a bra, a short skirt that looked like it had once been white, underwear, and pink Adidas high tops and short socks. He noted the body was in a moderate state of decomposition, and due to some bloating in her abdomen and limbs, he estimated that the girl had been in the water for more than a few days, but not longer than a few weeks. This was then confirmed by the marbled red and green hue of her skin, as her blood vessels had broken down and become visible like branches of a tree, or like, I guess, maybe how it looks whenever you get hit by lightning. On certain parts of her body, her skin had sloughed off completely and was lying detached in paper-thin sheets, which was yet another indication of a prolonged period of submersion in water. He attempted to put together a picture of what she had looked like, starting with the things that he could still see. Her hair was black and straight, with one side being shaved and the rest being medium length. The skin on her nose and cheeks had mostly slid down away from her face, and the globes of her eyes, while intact, were unrecognizable in a mask of red and pink. He knew it would be impossible to match the victim to a picture, but he did see another identifying feature, which was a tattoo between her shoulder blades that was still distinguishable through the decomp. It was a name, Eugene Fontaine, with a date beneath it and angel wings on either side. The police investigators emailed the picture of the tattoo to O'Donovan from the autopsy room gallery, and he immediately contacted the city's missing persons unit. They had in their files the name of a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Tina Fontaine. Which, I mean, she has the name Fontaine on her back, so right. I think it was pretty clear it was her. Tina had reportedly run away in early July of that year and had been listed as missing several times, which we know from past cases doesn't bode well for the investigation surrounding a disappearance. She was described as Aboriginal, 5'4", 100 pounds. In a recent photograph, her hair was black and shaved short on one side. It also noted that she was the daughter of Eugene Fontaine, who had been killed in 2011. Although the pictures of the slim young girl were vastly different from the bloated body that had been pulled from the river, her identity could be confirmed by the tattoo. And a full body x-ray revealed that Tina had no broken bones, though they observed several shallow depressions on the skin of her face, on her right cheek and forehead, and 2 more on her scalp. She was missing some of the underlying nose cartilage, and Ree also found more indentations on the back of her right thigh and the front of her left knee, but without conducting a full postmortem, he couldn't say whether they were caused by injuries or decomposition. One thing was clear, and that was that Tina did not put herself in that river. After some deliberation, O'Donovan asked investigators to crop the autopsy photos so only Tina's tattoo was visible. He found them to be some of the most distressing autopsy photos that he had seen in his entire career, and he was extremely reluctant to show them to Tina's family. Later that evening, just under 5 miles north from where Tina's body was discovered, police divers finally found the remains of Farron Hall. Unlike Tina, they announced that they weren't treating Hall's death as suspicious, though the coincidence of finding 2 bodies in the same river within hours of each other wasn't lost on the media, who obviously had primo headlines delivered to them.
Tina's foster mom, or aunt, Thelma, had only learned about the numerous missing persons reports filed for Tina when she called the CFS agency on August 15th and was told Tina had been missing for a week. 3 days later, RCMP officers were at her door to tell her that Tina's body had been found in the Red River. The news reported a young girl who was living on the streets and doing drugs, which Thelma found to be a stark contrast from the girl she knew only a few months earlier, who hung onto her arm when they were shopping and forced her to cross the street when someone was acting strange or drunk. The photo Sergeant O'Donovan showed her of Tina with one side of her head shaved broke Thelma's heart, saying her hair had been her pride and joy, and reached all the way down to her back. Her grandfather, who was a medicine man, used to say that Indigenous girls got their strength from their hair. It made them who they were, and if they kept it long, they would always be special. Tina's body was kept at home for 4 days with friends and family paying respect, just as they had done with Eugene, which we will talk about who Eugene is in just a moment. At the service that followed, Tina's cousins carried her coffin, each wearing her picture printed on feathers made of purple felt, which was her favorite color. Some of her family cut locks of their hair and placed them on her casket so she would still have strength in heaven. Then Thelma hosted a feast, burning a plate of food for Tina on a sacred fire. When she received Tina's ashes, she kept them near her at home for a week. Then on a sunny day in September, Thelma buried her in the same plot as her father. A thought that went through her mind that day was that all seasons change, and that comforted her as she contemplated that maybe Tina had been here for a reason, but that was only meant to stay for a brief time.
Which is a pretty sad thought for anybody, but I guess you can take comfort in it whenever someone dies early. Since detectives were working in the dark as far as the crime scene, time of death, a cell phone, as she didn't have one at all, or security footage, that meant that they had to explore every avenue to answer fundamental questions like how and where did she die, and then they looked to the pathologist for answers. Because it had already been concluded that Tina had no broken bones or injuries aside from the shallow depressions on her face, Dr. Dennis Ree needed to explore the underlying tissues of her face, nose, and forehead. First, he found something incredibly odd. The cartilage of her nose was completely missing, which was perplexing because the skin of her nose was still intact. He had a few theories of this. While the irregularity was not caused by a major blow, it was possible it was caused by a punch or a slap in the face, and he could not be sure that the cartilage had been destroyed before or after death, as it was possible one of the rocks in the duvet cover could have hit Tina in the face, or that fish in the river could be responsible for eating away the cartilage, as it's soft tissue, and that's the first thing that they go for. Mm-hmm. It wasn't fatal, but Dr. Ree wasn't sure what kind of role that it played in her murder. As we'll see, this is kind of a theme in her entire autopsy. There's really not a lot of hard evidence in it that came away from it. As the examination continued, he found no areas of bleeding that could have indicated a significant blow to her head. He examined her neck for any signs of strangulation, and in his experience, this was a much more common way that female homicide victims were murdered. Plus, assailants will typically use more force than necessary, which tends to leave evidence like bruising, blood spots, and damage to the larynx. Ooh, my own damage to the larynx here. He carefully examined each layer of skin and muscle, looking for anything out of the ordinary, but again, he found nothing unusual. Her hyoid bone in the front of her neck was also intact, which is often broken under pressure. Her spine had no fractures or dislocations, so it didn't really show him anything. While it's possible to strangle someone without leaving a mark, it is rare. Again, he couldn't rule out strangulation, but he couldn't say that it happened either. As he moved on to the internal exam, he found Tina's organs were still mostly intact, except for the soft tissue of the brain that had disintegrated from being submerged in water. Her heart and cardiovascular system were healthy and appeared to have been functioning normally. Then he examined her lungs, which could help determine if she had been alive or not when put into the river. I am assuming that he found no water in her lungs, which I deduce by the writer Joanna Jolly saying that, it's actually Joanna Jolly saying that there was a lack of evidence of drowning. So in my opinion, what I take away from that is that she doesn't have water in her lungs, so she probably was dead before going into the water. Ree then looked for evidence of sexual assault, and when she was found, she had been fully clothed with no rips in her clothing, which suggested that she wasn't struggling before her death. He also knew that she was a young runaway at high risk of exploitation, and it was very likely her murder was sexually motivated, but he didn't find anything to suggest that she had been sexually assaulted, though it was possible that the river had washed away any vital evidence in that regard. Just to be sure, he took swabs to be analyzed in the RCMP forensic lab in Ottawa to see if they could identify the DNA of a second person, which is obviously what they should be doing. Considering the lack of injuries to her body, Dr. Ree considered it could be possible that Tina died from an overdose. Considering the state of her body didn't allow for blood analysis, he gathered samples of evidence from her chest cavity, removed a section of her liver, and sent everything to the RCMP lab in Vancouver. The findings were sent back to Ree quickly. Her blood alcohol level was moderately high, just over the legal driving limit, but it was also possible, the lab warned, that it was falsely elevated due to decomposition, and either way, it wasn't high enough to be the cause of death. There was also THC in her system, which again is clearly not lethal, and there were no traces of crystal meth or cocaine or opioids. In his autopsy report for the Winnipeg police, he stated that Tina's cause of death was undetermined, as there was nothing that gave a clear indication of how she died. While he agreed that the circumstances in which she was found suggested that she had been killed by another person, he could not determine how she had been murdered. Additionally, it was possible that she had accidentally drowned and then someone concealed her body after the fact. Upon reading the report, Detective O'Donovan asked that Ree at least consider ruling that Tina had died from homicidal means, as she didn't put herself in a duvet cover, fill it with rocks, and tie a bunch of knots, then hop into the river.
Right.
But Ree would not change his determination. Then O'Donovan asked if he could give any insight on the post-mortem interval time between Tina's death and the discovery of her body. Ree told him a precise answer was impossible, but per his understanding of the decomposition in regard to the environment surrounding the body, it would be slowed due to being submerged in water, and that water was between 75 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit, or 24 degrees and 25 degrees Celsius. He estimated the postmortem interval of between 2 to 9 days. He added that he didn't think Tina's body had been lying exposed in the shallows for very long. So O'Donovan consulted with Sergeant Kevin Paul from the Winnipeg Police and an expert in underwater search and rescue. From looking at Tina's autopsy photos and how bloated her body was compared to the weight she was at the time of her death, he told O'Donovan that it was certain she had been in the water for no less than 7 days, most likely around 10. He theorized that she had been thrown in off the wooden wharf of the Alexander docks and that she would have stayed weighted on the riverbed until the combination of bloating and the River Rouge, the boat that we talked about, the River Rouge's engines churning the water, freed her body, where she would have then floated with the current until becoming caught in the reeds in the shallow water around 100 yards away. The detectives were collecting security footage from around the dock area and found the most promising to be the one on Muir Hotel that pointed towards a parking lot next to the docks. They were able to pinpoint a time frame to narrow down the footage they needed to search through. Also at this time, IDENT, the Forensic Identification Unit, had begun their work, and Constable Susan Roy Hagman, who we talked about earlier, had been the original IDENT officer on the scene when they recovered Tina's body. She was now coordinating the forensic examination.
They knew in this case, without a crime scene, there was little to go on. Their first task was identifying where the rocks had come from. They found 4 large pieces of stone, a piece of brick, and a number of small stone fragments. The stone was identified as Tyndall limestone, a stone native to Manitoba and used along the length of the Red River to prevent erosion along its banks in multiple places, which made it not very helpful in determining the location where the body entered the river. In their examination of the duvet cover, they found 29 individual hairs, 7 grouped in a small cluster. There were 4 kinds of fiber that had come from somewhere else, which were red, blue and red, and black. During this process, they also found a hair from a vaginal swab, and all of these items were sent to the lab for testing. Once they got the results, they were once again let down by the lack of answers they delivered. There wasn't enough biological material on any of the hairs or swabs to extract a profile. Understandably frustrated, O'Donovan decided to send the material to a private lab in Quebec, which specialized in mitochondrial DNA testing. The hair found from the vaginal swab they determined came from Tina herself, along with 3 other hairs they found in the duvet. From the remaining hairs, they identified at least 8 different unknown profiles, which they did not have suspects to match with them at that point, but, maybe one day. The duvet cover had been purchased from Costco in a pattern called Chloe Green, and with a little investigation, they found 864 of these duvet covers sold in the area, which they seriously went out canvassing interviewing everyone who had bought one of the covers in the area, seeing if they could be accounted for, and checked the name against the police register for serious offenses or sex crime priors, and found no one of potential interest.
So the following morning, O'Donovan had assembled... the following morning after finding Tina's body in the river, O'Donovan had assembled 6 pairs of detectives assigned to focus on Tina's case primarily. They held a press conference that morning showing a poster of the most recent photo of Tina looking directly into the camera. She was wearing large hoop earrings, her hair was short, side-swept bangs, and one side was shaved completely, and she was smiling in the photo. Although he had a plan to present each fact point by point calmly, seeing her picture in contrast to the autopsy photo that was now tucked away forever in his mind, O'Donovan was enraged and decided to just speak off the cuff. So O'Donovan began, "This is a child that's been murdered. I think society would be horrified if we found a litter of kittens or pups in the river in this condition." He paused for a moment, allowing everyone to digest what he just said. The room was buzzing. Deaths of Indigenous youth were nothing new to the press, but hearing a detective speak about an Indigenous victim with such passion was not typical, as sad as that might be. He didn't want to reveal any details regarding how she had died to the press, obviously to keep those details private in order to be able to identify the killer. He told them that she was tiny, wanted to stress her vulnerability, and continued, "This is a child, so I mean society should be horrified. She was barely in the city for a little over a month. She's definitely been exploited, taken advantage of, and murdered, and put into the river in this condition." It seemed that O'Donovan, a seasoned stoic, was shook by the murder of Tina Fontaine. His wife Mary would note that in all the years that he had been a detective, he never referred to a victim by her first name until Tina. 2 days after her body was discovered, over 1,000 citizens of Winnipeg gathered at the Alexander Docks for a memorial of both Tina and Farron Hall's lives. They marched down the main street, some holding signs to bring attention to the issue of crime against the Indigenous community. It was only a few weeks after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, and the protesters hoped to get a spark of similar outrage within their own community. This was a complete coincidence. I didn't even realize that this had happened that closely the last case we talked about. Tina's official guardian was her great-aunt Thelma Favell, who Tina lived with. Thelma said that Tina disappeared after going on a trip to visit her biological mother in the city. Thelma said she had tried to call Tina over and over, eventually contacting the police and Provincial Child Welfare Agency to report her as missing and in danger of exploitation. Like we said earlier, she didn't hear any news for days until a grandniece alerted her to a post on Facebook by her cousins in Winnipeg that said a body had just been pulled out of the Red River and had been ID'd as Tina's. She reminded herself that it was just Facebook and that the police hadn't called her, so everything was okay. But then the next morning is when she woke up to the 2 officers at her door confirming that the body was indeed Tina's body that had been pulled out of the river. Thelma said that it felt like her heart was being ripped out of her body. "I don't understand why it had to take Tina's death to open everybody's eyes to the fact that there's a problem out there." Very true. Sag King, where Tina lived with Thelma, was 1.5 hours north of Winnipeg. Its name means mouth of the river. The reserve had the unfortunate distinction of having the most missing and murdered women and girls of any Indigenous community in Canada. Activists said that the lack of jobs and overwhelming poverty were forcing women to leave the reservation to find work, separating them from their community and making them vulnerable to predators. In the same vein, the women of Sag King were often survivors of domestic violence, abuse, addiction, mental illness, and suicide. When the treaty with the government was signed 150 years prior, it was in the hopes that the government would help protect the Anishinaabe Ojibwe and enable them to thrive. And I'm sorry that my voice went up like that when I was trying to say that name. Instead, they were forced into assimilation programs to strip them of their culture and force them into a European Christian way of life. The central pillar of these policies was the establishment of the residential school system, which inevitably destroyed communities, tore families apart, and stunted the ability of generations of parents to raise their own children.
So Tina's paternal grandfather was a residential school survivor, which is a system which kind of warrants its own episode. I hadn't heard of it until I started researching this one.
It's awful.
And for those of us who don't know, in Canada, it's called the Indian Residential School System. that's gross even saying, so I'm just going to start calling it the residential school system, was a network of boarding schools for Indigenous people. The network was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs and administered by Christian churches, which sounds like a recipe for disaster in and of itself, and here's why. The school system was created for the purpose of removing Indigenous children from their own beautiful, vibrant culture and assimilating them into the dominant Canadian culture, quote, to kill the Indian in the child. The system was in place for more than 100 years, and about 30% of Indigenous children, so about 150,000, were placed in residential schools nationally. The number of school-related deaths remains unknown due to, of course, an incomplete historical record, which I'm sure wasn't exactly just happenstance. The residential school system harmed Indigenous children significantly by removing them from their families, depriving them of their ancestral languages, and exposing many of them to physical and sexual abuse. Students were also subjected to forced enfranchisement as assimilated citizens that removed their legal identity as natives. Disconnected from their families and cultures, they were forced to speak English or French, and students who attended the residential school system often graduated being unable to fit back into their communities, but also remaining subject to racist attitudes in mainstream Canadian society.
It's a lose-lose situation.
100%. The system tragically ultimately proved successful in disrupting the transmission of Indigenous practices and beliefs across generations. The legacy of the system has been linked to an increased prevalence of post-traumatic stress, alcoholism, substance abuse, and suicide, which persist within Indigenous communities today.
It wasn't until 1990 when Phil Fontaine, a distant relative of Tina's, who was also the head of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, spoke out about the abuse he went through while at a residential school in Sanking, which was then called Fort Alexander. Following his testimony, thousands of other residential school survivors joined him to file what would become the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, which eventually led to a settlement agreement that included the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission traveled across Canada for 6 years to hear testimony from over 150,000 former students who had been taken from their families and were forced to spend much of their childhood locked away. When they were finished, their published report would include 94 recommendations, one being the establishment of a national inquiry into why so many Indigenous women and girls, many who were forced into residential schools, were being killed. Tina's great-aunt Thelma managed to avoid residential school, though both her parents and older brother had all struggled through the system. Their distant relative, Doug Fontaine, who attended the Fort Alexander Residential School, would tell them stories about how the nuns would try to rub their breasts up against him and how he would wet the bed at night to prevent himself from being molested by them. Jeez. After her sister asked her to help her raise 8 children, Thelma began the role she would carry on for much of her life, being a professional foster mother. It was in this role that she would eventually care for Tina's father, her nephew, Eugene Fontaine, when he was just a child.
So Tina's father, Eugene Fontaine, left his home in Sanking First Nation, about 75 miles north of Winnipeg, to move to Winnipeg itself, and he developed an addiction to alcohol as well. Tina's mother, Valentina, or Tina, Duck, I'll call her Valentina just to distinguish between her and her daughter, was raised in Blood Vein First Nation, 160 miles north of Winnipeg, and starting at the age of 6, Tina's mother, Valentina, was removed from and returned to her mother several times by Manitoba Child and Family Services. Valentina experienced a number of significant traumas as a young child, which the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth said in a 2019 report, quote, were not appropriately addressed.
What's new?
I mean, to put it in the lightest way possible. Mm-hmm. In 1992, at age 10, Valentina was permanently taken from her family and, of course, moved repeatedly and began to be sexually exploited by adults. Her trauma also caused her to reach out to alcohol and drugs. The Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth says little was done to intervene and protect her, which again does not come as a shock. So when Valentina and Eugene met, Valentina was 12 and Eugene was 23. Child and Family Services records also show that they knew that their relationship was sexual, and they also knew that Eugene's past had involved violence and severe addictions. Their files additionally noted that Valentina would frequently run away from her foster placements to stay with Eugene. In 1994, Valentina described to her caseworker feeling depressed, suicidal, isolated, alone, and unloved. And in the spring of 1996, at 14, Valentina gave birth to her first child, which was immediately and permanently taken from her by Child and Family Services. A year later, they had another daughter, Sarah, but Eugene's addiction made him more violent towards Valentina, and as his addiction worsened, so did his unpredictability, and the couple would eventually split up. When she was 1, Tina was removed from her family's care for the first time, and then it happened again when she was 2. She was then returned to the care of Eugene, and then when she was 5 years old, Eugene placed her and Sarah with her great aunt through a private guardianship agreement.
Eugene was still drinking heavily, and he had found out that he had cancer of the lymph nodes, and believing himself to be unable to manage alone, that is why he asked Thelma to raise his daughters. And although she was older now and worried she wouldn't be able to keep up with the young girls, she also knew that they could not be put into the child welfare system. She felt the system was too eager to remove Indigenous children from their homes, rather than to provide the long-term support to the families that they needed to keep them together. She also knew that there were some in the foster care system that used it to receive money or take advantage in other predatory ways, which, again, we've talked about in the past on the show. So Thelma and her husband Joe decided to take the girls in and raise them as their own. As she got older, Tina became more and more enamored with babies and children, thinking that she would like to be a foster mother one day, as Thelma was such a, I believe, loving example.
Eugene would visit Thelma on Sundays, bring them presents on holidays and birthdays, but the girls knew he was incredibly ill. Then in 2011, the routine abruptly ended on October 31st when Tina was 12. Thelma's sister called to say she was with the police and they had found Eugene's body on the reserve. Thelma rushed to the spot, which was an old road that ran along the Red River. At the back of the property was a shed that had been cordoned off by yellow police tape, and within it she saw Eugene's body lying on the ground outside. Eugene had been on a 3-day bender with 2 friends and had gotten into an argument with them. The friends ganged up on him, kicked him in the head, and tied him up behind the shed where he ended up dying from the injuries they'd inflicted. He was only 41. The death of their father devastated Tina and Sarah, who, like mostly everyone, couldn't understand why someone would be so violent and cruel to end his life. Her aunt recalled the violent death of her father deeply affected her. Tina's aunt recalled that the violent death of her father deeply affected her, saying she was very hurt, very lost, and that's when she drifted away. In 2019, the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth noted that Child and Family Services was clearly aware that Tina was struggling in the period between her father's death and her own. In fact, records from the time documented that Tina had become increasingly absent from school. She missed assignments and she was suspended from school. She also got into verbal and physical confrontations that resulted in the police being called, and she was getting medical treatment from self-harm, and she was reported missing 3 times. During this time in her life, her family had repeatedly asked for help from Child and Family Services.
So Tina obviously was struggling with anger, which she directed inward. She made repeated calls to victim services. Like you said, she never received any counseling for the grief that she was experiencing. After multiple incidents of kids bullying the girls over their father's murder and Tina getting into multiple fights, Thelma decided to pull the girls out of their classes on the reserve and put them into public school at Powerview Pine Falls. This decision paid off quickly as Tina excelled in math and science classes, immediately collected a group of friends who all felt that they were quote-unquote misfits and had once been bullied, and she took on a protector role similar to the one that she had with her sister. But her sadness following her father's murder was still there, and Tina would go through bouts of isolation and crying, and she was rarely the happy-go-lucky girl that she once was, as her moods often remained dark. And I was like, well, so I'm right there with you, babe. On January 1st, 2014, Tina turned 15 and asked for 2 gifts. One she gave herself, which was the tattoo of her father's name, birth, and death dates, and angel wings between her shoulder blades. And the second gift was that Thelma allow her to go to Winnipeg to reconnect with her biological mother. And although Valentina hadn't seen Tina or Sarah since Eugene had taken them to live with Thelma, she reappeared after his funeral when she called to speak to both of her daughters after getting their number from the funeral director. It did annoy Thelma, to be fair, but Tina was glad for the reconnection, and she told her counselor at the reserve that she had confusing feelings about her mother that alternated between anger and love, and she didn't understand why her mother had given her up, but she also wanted to be a part of her life, which I think anybody could understand. Mm-hmm. Valentina's call came at a crossroads of sorts for Tina, where she was simultaneously mourning her father's death while also exploring the world outside of the sheltered walls of the reserve. She began to rebel, running away for the first time in 2013, eventually arriving at Valentina's home in Winnipeg. Once back in Sagkeeng, Tina struggled with the strict rules that Thelma and Joe had always established. They also had banned alcohol after Thelma suffered a stroke at age 40, and Tina smoked marijuana and was suspended from school, and Thelma saw that Tina had posted provocative selfies on Facebook and was chatting with adult men that she hadn't met, and it was just kind of a bunch of stuff that was going on that was a little bit out of her control. One evening during an argument, she slashed her forearms with a pin. She desperately wanted to go to Winnipeg to visit Valentina, not only because she wanted to experience the city, but Valentina had also mentioned that she had younger half-sisters, and Tina was elated to meet them. Thelma called Valentina's caseworker, who told her that she was confident that Valentina was sober and not selling sex on the streets to fund her drug habit. And so, Thelma said that the girls could go visit her. However, CFS said that they had no record of this interaction in which Thelma called to find out the status of Valentina. I feel like that's just a matter of, they just didn't write it down. Right. Then in April, but the visits made Tina restless. Going and visiting her mom made Tina restless. And on the morning of March 2nd, a day after Eugene's birthday, Thelma went to wake Tina up for school and found an empty bed. She called the police, and then she called Valentina and was relieved to find that Tina was there safe. Police brought Tina home, and Thelma asked how she had gotten to Winnipeg all on her own, but Tina just shrugged it off. Then in April, she went missing again. Her friend, Larry Dumas, a deaf Indigenous young man she met in Winnipeg, brought her home this time. Thelma found Larry polite and was somewhat reassured by this. When she asked Tina once again why she had run away and how she had run away, Tina completely avoided the question. After this, Thelma called Child and Family Services and requested that they take Tina into care because she was having difficulty managing her. A social worker came out in May to speak with Tina and arrange her counseling. Unfortunately, the sessions that she had scheduled were 46 miles away, making it very difficult for Tina to attend, and instead, she asked Thelma to allow her to spend more time with her biological mother. Thelma made a deal with her that if she got good grades that semester, she could visit Valentina 1 week in the summer. She somehow believed this to be the case, even though school records showed that Tina was absent from most classes that summer. Thelma's daughter, Samantha, and son Brian volunteered to drive Tina and Sarah down to Winnipeg for that week vacation to visit their mother. The day they were to leave, Sarah had a change of heart, and she said she didn't feel comfortable with Valentina, so Tina went to Winnipeg alone. She only had $60 and a prepaid phone card in case something didn't work out, and she needed to be picked up. Thelma then chose not to call Valentina's social worker again. She chose to trust the woman was staying sober and doing well. This is something she would later live to regret, as Valentina's life had begun to spiral out of control, and she'd lost custody of her younger children in the period of that time between the last visit and then this one. When they arrived at her home, it was locked up. Brian and Samantha were worried, but Tina reassured them that it was just fine and had them drop her off at Valentina's sister's house, where she said she'd be safe. The area of Winnipeg where Valentina lived and the only area Tina knew was called the North End, and it's a dark underbelly of crime and violence. Gangs dominated by Indigenous leaders dealt in drugs, sex, and robbery in the area. Sexual exploitation was also an issue in the North End. In the early 20th century, the street prostitution of Winnipeg split into two districts, the High Track and the Low Track. The High Track was operated in the upscale offices and theaters in the Market Avenue and Exchange District, and it had upmarket clientele paying a little bit more, while the Low Track was a rougher scene. It came with much more risk, and it was less costly and ran in the district along the railroad tracks. In more modern times, the High Track district transitioned to online escort sites and massage parlors, while the Low Track continued to operate and extend into the West End district, which was close to the University of Winnipeg. The police in the area estimate that those selling sex, young women, middle-aged women, transgender women, grandmothers, 90% of them were Indigenous. Jeez. It's quite a large percentage. Jeez. After going one full week without hearing from Tina, Thelma called Valentina's house number and found that the line had been disconnected. She and Joe drove to Winnipeg and found Valentina's house abandoned. Terrified, Thelma called CFS, who were able to locate Valentina and assured Thelma that the woman did not have her, which is not comforting at all. Thelma was in the process of pleading with them to arrange for legit counseling for Tina when she got back home, when her sister Sarah showed her a Facebook message that she'd gotten from Tina. In the picture, she had a black eye and scratched face, and the message accompanying it read, "Chubbs," which was a nickname given to Sarah by her father. "Look what our mom did to me." Thelma would later learn that Valentina got Tina drunk, beat her, and then threw her out onto the streets. The police put out a missing persons alert, but it was shown on the news only once, which would obviously not have any real significant impact on the situation. Sarah received another message from Tina, this time saying, "Tell Mama and Papa I love them, but I'm not ready to come home." Thelma believed Tina to be in danger of exploitation and contacted CFS to take on her case. When detectives interviewed Valentina, she was intoxicated and inconsolable with grief, unable to tell them anything about Tina's time in Winnipeg past their first encounter, where she'd beaten Tina and then sent her out on the road. They then interviewed her sometimes boyfriend, Joseph Nanakawap. Joseph was an Ojibwe-speaking man from the remote reserve of Lake St. Martin, and he recalled seeing Tina 4 to 5 times, often with a guy named Cody. He last saw her in late July, early August, when Tina and Cody showed up at his place in the North End, saying that they had no place to go. He let them stay on his couch, and by the time he woke up the next day, they had already gone. He said she never seemed under the influence of alcohol or drugs, but he hadn't been concerned for her safety. A longtime friend of Tina and Sarah's father, Steve Whitehurst, who they called Uncle Steve, also mentioned Cody to the investigators. He said that the pair visited his house in the North End and left several shopping bags full of clothes for him to watch over. A few days later, they came back saying that they didn't like the shelter where where CFS had tried to put Tina, and they asked if they could stay with him. Steve agreed on 2 conditions. He said Cody couldn't stay over 24/7. He thought the boy had a controlling influence on Tina and was wary of him. And he also said that he had to know where she was when she left. And she didn't like those restrictions, so she did not stay with him. Right. Both Tina's biological grandmother and her father's sister saw Tina a few times when she was in town, knowing she had a falling out with her biological mother. It seemed to Detective O'Donovan that while all these various family members knew she'd run away from Grandma again and that she'd fallen out with her mom, none of them tried to get her to go home or at the very least come stay with them. Tina's aunt Lana told a CBC reporter at one point that she suspected that the fight Valentina and Tina had gotten into was because Valentina had tried to force Tina into sex work, just as Valentina herself had been forced into it at a young age. This was not confirmed by O'Donovan, but it definitely is not out of the realm of possibility. As a side story to help support that, 2 years after Tina's death, her mother's sister's daughter was accused of human trafficking for forcing a young woman into prostitution, which she denied and said that she herself was exploited. 1 year later, the cousin, whose name was Janine, was found dead from a gunshot in a drug house in the North End of Winnipeg after being mistaken in a fight over crystal meth, her identity being mistaken in a fight over crystal meth. So it's definitely, it's like the cycle of abuse that continues on,
Right, of course. The detectives now interviewed the obvious suspects, which were the guys that Tina had been dating. First up was Larry Dumas, who brought Tina back home one of the instances that she had run away. Thelma described him as a real gentleman. Larry said he had known Tina 5 to 6 months and they had been a couple for some of that time. He told them he broke up with her because she wanted them to sell drugs together and he refused. He said he later found out through Facebook that she was actually dating Cody. The last time he saw her was at Portage Place, the mall downtown, when he ran into Tina and Cody. He said yes, there was tension between them there, but that it was resolved when they went their separate ways. The last he'd heard from her was at the beginning of August through a Facebook message. To O'Donovan, Larry Dumas did not appear to be a suspect. Next was Cody Mason, an 18-year-old from northern Manitoba's St. Teresa's Point First Nation Reserve. Cody had come to Winnipeg a few months prior to help his father recuperate from an accident. Detectives were able to verify through flight manifests and hotel records that Cody flew to Winnipeg from Manitoba in early August, and both he and his father spent the last few days at a hotel near the airport where a girl matching Tina's description stayed with them. Both Cody and his father flew back to Manitoba, and since Tina was seen after this, Cody Mason was not considered to be a suspect either. Tina and Cody's time together was erratic and spent hopping from place to place, staying long enough only to sleep, eat, and use Facebook.
Yes.
Cody said he experimented with pills, crack, and pot, but he stressed he did not have the idea to sell drugs. He said Tina had gotten hooked up with a dealer who gave her baggies of weed, which she would wander around with around the north and west ends, asking people if they wanted to get high, while Cody stood by her side. When asked if he knew someone called Sebastian, Cody immediately recognized the name. He said the first time he met the man was in July. They saw him biking by and shouted they had nowhere to go. He told them they could stay in an empty basement apartment a few blocks away, opening it up with a screwdriver, coming back the next morning to let them out, and gave them $20 for breakfast. All three of them hung out several times over the summer, and at one point he took the two to a yard of a house on a street that led down to the dock of the Red River close to where Tina's body was found, and showed them a tent he told them was his home.
And we will talk a little bit more about this Sebastian fella in a second. Detectives uncovered that Tina had stayed at the Nadinaway group home in the North End on July 23rd, where she was supposed to stay for 2 weeks, but only 3 days in, she failed to appear for curfew, and then following a 24-hour waiting period for her to show up, the staff reported her missing. She would reappear the following day, but then, one day after that, on July 29th, she would fail to show up yet again, and the home reported her missing yet again. This time, the home packed up her stuff and gave her bed to another vulnerable youth. Tina's story was getting unprecedented levels of interest in the community, especially from the Indigenous community anxious to help. Police received a call from a resident in Nadinaway who contacted them to say that he remembered having a conversation with Tina where she told him that she was dealing drugs with an ex-boyfriend she didn't name. She said the ex worked for a man she called the boss and owed him $9,000, but that he'd run away without paying. She told him that she was continuing to sell on her own to make up the debt. Another woman contacted the detectives to say that she had met Tina one evening in mid-July with a friend out in the North End. She said Tina and a friend walked by and stopped to pet their dog. The girl who matched Tina's description told them that she was from Sagking and was kicked out of her house. The woman said she was concerned about Tina's well-being and had pulled her aside to ask her if her boyfriend was hitting her, to which Tina told her he wasn't. She did, however, tell her that they were on their way to see their dealer. After they left, they heard screaming coming from the direction the teens had gone. They heard an older woman shout, "Why did you bring her here?" and "Quit fucking looking at her," before Tina and her friend reappeared looking shaken. The woman asked them what had happened, and Tina responded, "I can't control whether a guy likes looking at me or not." Another woman came forward to say that she met Tina at Portage Place on Sunday, August 3rd, and they had gone to a friend's to smoke drugs. A few days later, on the morning of August 7th, she went to a rooming house well known to be a quote-unquote crack shack run by a Kenyan and a Nigerian who had ties to the Indian posse. She said that she saw Tina in one of the rooms looking uncomfortable under a dirty white blanket, which made O'Donovan think of the duvet cover, so he made a mental note to show it to the witnesses. Days into the investigation, the homicide unit met to discuss all the information that they had gathered so far. Their strongest theory was that Tina had been killed because of links to drugs and organized crime. The story about Tina's ex owing their dealer $9,000 stood out as a possible motive. But most of the seasoned detectives thought this story actually seemed too sketchy to be believable, as many, anonymous tips might be. When interviewed, Larry Dumas said he had no knowledge of Tina owing anyone any money, and if she did, it wasn't in connection to him. The detectives had been able to confirm that Tina sold small amounts of marijuana on the street, but nothing suggested she was moving thousands of dollars worth of any drugs. And considering the short amount of time that she had been in the city, it was also unlikely that any dealer was going to entrust a teenager with that much money. So it was likely that in that situation, Tina was just talking herself up a bit. However, the lead on the rooming house, Crack Shack, owned by the Nigerian and Kenyan men, seemed like it might be promising for investigators. They had been able to confirm that Tina had visited the house and met the men in person, and it was possible that they had a sexual interest in her, or that they had a conflict with her which gave them a motive for murder. Police were on the lookout for the men, and O'Donovan was left attempting to find any information on Tina's whereabouts August 8th and August 9th, as those were believed to be her last days and would be crucial in finding her killer. Between June 30th and August 17th, when her body was found, Tina was registered as missing 5 separate times by authorities. The first time was July 10th, when Thelma alerted police in Southeast Child and Family Services that she had disappeared in the city, and from the start, the missing persons unit labeled her at risk of sexual exploitation. The next was a week later on July 17th, when patrol officers responded to a call in the North End that a girl was being dragged down a street by her arm and was screaming for help. They arrived, finding both Tina and Cody intoxicated, after which Tina was placed in a short-term detox facility and then given a room at the Capri Hotel south of the city. This was a common practice at the time due to limited foster homes and shelter space. These hotel stays were meant to be a temporary situation, but would often turn into weeks and even months in many cases. The environment that a hotel provides was little protection against the exploitation, drug use, and issues that arose due to untreated mental health issues. CFS had contracted out the supervision of their charges to underqualified and likely underpaid staff that weren't trained for one-on-one support that was needed in many of these cases. In the year following Tina's death, a CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, investigation found that the hotels had become magnets for drugs and sex work, and the contracted staff were doing nothing to shield the young people from these activities. But in Tina's case, as we mentioned, she ran away pretty quickly, and CFS filed the second missing persons report with the police. Her whereabouts remained unknown for another week until CFS found her in a bed at the Nadinaway shelter, and then she had left that, returned again, and then left again, prompting the next 2 missing persons reports. It's kind of hard to keep track of them all.
Yeah.
On the morning of Friday, August 8th, Tina had been seen next to a property owned by the University of Winnipeg in the inner-city West End. It was the Helen Betty Osborne building, named after the teenage Indigenous girl that we talked briefly about at the beginning of this episode, who had been beaten to death in 1971. In an ominous coincidence of sorts, a security guard had been called out at 10 a.m. because Tina had been asleep under an overhang in the parking lot adjacent to that Helen Betty Osborne building. When the security officer arrived, she found Tina dressed in a green zip-up sweater, pink high tops, and a white skirt that was pulled down to her ankles. She wasn't wearing underwear, and her legs were covered in what appeared to be either cigarette burns or mosquito bites. Concerned that she was the victim of a sexual assault, the guard tried to wake her up but was unable, and so she called an ambulance. The detectives were able to find security footage from across the lot that showed a girl walking in the rain, holding a newspaper above her head, and moving with a slight limp. They immediately recognized that it was Tina, who was noticeably thinner than the pictures that were taken of her that Thelma had showed them only weeks prior. The footage then showed her sitting down next to the wall, where she would later be found by the security guard, then the paramedics arriving and escorting her into the ambulance. At the time, Tina told the medics that she had been smoking weed and taking Gabbies, which was the street name for an epilepsy drug, gabapentin, which people were taking to get high. When she arrived to the hospital, she refused to speak to the male doctor on duty, so Dr. Andrea Wilkie Gilmore was called in to examine her. Wilkie Gilmore noted that Tina was not answering questions and avoiding eye contact. She said she smelled of alcohol and had a blister burn on her lip, but seemed otherwise healthy. Tina fell into a deep sleep, only waking when a nurse came to draw her blood and another time when they came to change her into a hospital gown. At 3 p.m., the doctor came back for a second exam, and her blood results showed that she had been drinking, though the level of alcohol in her blood was pretty low. She was still waiting for the toxicology results when she asked Tina what drugs that she had taken. She wasn't showing the tremors or jerky eye movements of a Gabby overdose, but it was clear to the doctor that she had taken something. But she was now insisting that she'd only drank and smoked weed. Since she was found without underwear, the doctor asked about any voluntary or non-voluntary sexual activity, but Tina would not answer and then refused a gynecological exam. When asked about the blister on her lip, she responded that she had fallen a few days prior, but the doctor recognized it as the type of blister caused by smoking crack or meth through a plastic pin. The doctor later said that she counseled Tina not to run away from CFS about the dangers that she could be in if she did, but they could not hold her there forever, so she was discharged with the CFS worker, Kimberly Shute, who had been called in and had been sitting with her that whole day at the hospital. The security footage shows the two leaving the hospital together. A few hours later, the hospital would get the toxicology results back, which would show that she tested positive for amphetamines, marijuana, and cocaine. Shute had met Tina a few times in the months prior, and this afternoon she took her to McDonald's after leaving the hospital while they waited for her colleagues to secure a place for her to stay that night. While they sat in the car eating their food, they talked about random things, including bicycles, after which Tina said she had once had one but had lost it. Shute told her if she stayed in CFS care, they could find the money to get her a new bike, and Tina responded, "My friend Sebastian is going to find me a bike." This was a name Shute hadn't heard before, and she asked who Sebastian was. And Tina responded, he's a 62-year-old meth user. Good.
Okay.
A place for Tina. She also got very defensive. The lady was like, okay, well, that doesn't sound. And she was like, just don't worry about it, is what she said. A place for Tina would then be found at the Best Western Charterhouse Hotel in downtown Winnipeg, where her care was handed over to a member of Complete Care, which is a private agency contracted by the welfare agency. The worker that day had been getting Tina's room ready and noting how tired she looked and told her to go to her room and rest. Tina refused, saying that she had some friends to meet at Portage Place. The woman told her that wasn't a great idea, and she was still in her flimsy hospital pants, and it was a cold night, but Tina promised to get back by the 11 p.m. curfew and left. The woman had no power to stop her. It was after that night, when Tina failed to return, and then the following day at 2 p.m., that the final missing persons report would be filed, and it was on August 9th. Detectives believed that Tina intended to come back to the hotel after going to Portage Place, as she left all her belongings in the room. They located some photos from security footage outside a restaurant on the West End, and Tina was wearing the white skirt that she was found in earlier that day. O'Donovan strongly suspected that she went to meet Sebastian regarding the new bike.
On August 11th, an anonymous tip came in that Tina had been seen at 4 o'clock in the morning on August 9th. Then another from the same number came saying Tina was seen with a black man. After looking up the number, they discovered it belonged to an 18-year-old Indigenous girl named Katrina that was living in the North End and told detectives that she often spent time on the streets. She had grown up in CFS and was trying to help other street girls in need, and this is how she met Tina. She said she first met her on August 7th when she struck up a conversation on the West End with her, and Tina told her she was 16 and working the streets, which streets, which alarmed Katrina. She pretended to go get cigarettes and told some police in a cruiser nearby that there was a little girl out selling her body. But by the time she went back to her, Tina had disappeared. But within the hour, she had come back saying she was finished with the customer and now had money to buy drugs. She went into the crack shack on Furby Street and came out with a bag of weed. And she told Katrina she thought was laced with crack and meth. She confided to her that she had been experimenting with those 3 drugs for a while and was officially missing from CFS care. Katrina told her CFS story and felt like they made a connection. They hung out until 2 a.m. when Katrina suggested they go to a youth services shelter to grab some food, hoping she might be able to get Tina to stay there overnight. But Tina wasn't going to have any of that and checked out shortly after checking in. Since Tina had told her she thought the drugs were starting to kick in and she was hallucinating, Katrina wanted to stay close to her, but suddenly a black truck pulled up and Tina walked over, got in the passenger seat. At first, Katrina thought Tina knew the driver, but eventually realized he was just cruising the neighborhood for sex. She panicked, hurriedly waving over a police officer who would follow the car, but she found out later they arrested the man and let Tina go into the night. These 2 officers were Constables Brock Jansen and Craig Houle, who told O'Donovan they were at the end of a night shift when they followed the black truck Tina had gotten into. After they had arrested the driver on multiple infractions, including driving with an expired license, Tina gave her name to them as Tessa Two Hearts, and when they were unable to find her in the system, she gave them yet another fake name. After pulling nothing up a second time, she finally gave them her real name, and it pulled up no orders or warrants against her. She told the police that she was staying at the nearby Quest Inn, and being that it was 6 o'clock in the morning and light out, he thought she wasn't in any trouble and let her go. In hindsight, he realized that he should have known she was young and in trouble and paid more attention to these details, but at the time he thought she was dressed maturely and could have passed for 18. So this is clearly an issue with minorities, as minority children are often identified as being much older than they actually are, but the police had missed the previous missing persons reports on Tina, which Houle admitted was an oversight due to his inexperience.
O'Donovan was furious the 2 officers had withheld vital information and threatened to destroy the goodwill he was building with the Indigenous community. The officers were assigned to non-operational duties, and a public statement about the unacceptable behavior of ignoring a young girl's vulnerability and how it would not stand any longer was issued. The driver of the black truck was, however, able to be ruled out as a suspect in Tina's murder, as he had been taken to a drunk tank overnight, and it was later that same morning that she had been found in the parking lot and taken to the hospital. After the hospital and leaving the hotel, she ran into Katrina again, where she told her new friend everything that had happened, and then said, "I want to go home to San King where I'm loved," which is terribly sad, considering that she never got back home. It was then around 4 a.m. on Saturday, August 9th, the girls had stopped to share cigarettes on a curbside. A skinny young black man walked past, clearly on drugs, offering $20 for oral sex. Tina agreed, telling Katrina to wait for her. She'd be back in 20 minutes. Katrina followed the pair, concerned for her safety, but lost them in the darkness once they crossed the street. She waited for Tina for over an hour, then asked a couple of other girls if they would be able to help her look for her friend. They all searched for over an hour, but Tina never reappeared. 2 days later is when Katrina sent the anonymous texts to the police. O'Donovan found the other sex workers and verified the search for Tina that night. He presented Katrina with a photo lineup that included headshots of the Kenyan and Nigerian men from the crack shack, and Katrina recognized one of them as the man that Tina had walked off with. The man was put under surveillance because, as far as detectives knew, he was the last person to see Tina alive. But then more tips came in. A woman called in saying that she had seen Tina multiple times, the last being the afternoon of August 9th at the bus stop outside the downtown Millennium Library. She said the girl looked very thin and had her hair in a ponytail, but it kept falling out because one side was shaved. She told the girl she was too young to be on the streets, and the girl told her that she wanted to go home with the woman so that she could be looked after by her. The woman found this odd and concerning, but also felt that this was a stranger, and so she simply bought the girl a bus ticket and then told her that she hoped she would be able to get somewhere safe. If that's true, that would mean that the black man was not the last person to see her alive, and therefore was probably not the suspect in her murder. So 60-year-old Robert Sango was a former bank robber who had been convicted of a list of offenses in the 80s. He told detectives that while on parole at the halfway house that August, he had gotten into the habit of sitting outside the bus stop for a last smoke before 11 o'clock curfew. And this is the same halfway house where they had Tina staying, where that had the 11 o'clock curfew. On August 6th, he had been doing just that when a young girl came running around the corner, heading straight for a payphone nearby. She called someone really quick and slammed it down when she was finished. She walked towards Sango, asking if she could have a cigarette. He said he teased her for being too young, but said yes, and then she began to cry. So he told her to sit down and tell him what was wrong. He said Tina sobbed and told him that she had been with a friend and her boyfriend when they had left her alone with an older man who was aggressive and called her a tramp and a whore when she did not comply with his advances or, assault. She said the man stole a truck and that she had to run to the payphone to call the police about it. She told him that she was a runaway, to which he responded that she should definitely not go around saying that to people, especially in the North End where someone could easily take advantage of her vulnerability. Sango's friend arrived and they said that they would watch her as she went down Main Street to make sure no one was following her, which she was concerned about. Then, just under 2 weeks later, that same friend pointed out a story in the paper about the girl that had been found in the river, and he realized it was Tina and called police. O'Donovan found that there was, in fact, a 911 call that night where a girl reported a man named Sebastian having stolen a truck. After speaking with Cody about the man named Sebastian living in that tent in those people's yards, the detectives paid a visit to the home to speak to the people that lived there. They told of a homeless man the family took pity on, a man they knew as Frenchie. The matriarch of the family said he could stay in the tent in their backyard and also use their shower, laundry, and join the family while they sat out around their fire pit. She said he took an unnatural interest in her 15-year-old daughter and always seemed to want to get her drunk or high. The daughter said he told her if she could get him a place to stay in the house that he'd have sex with her as though it was some fucking treat for her. It's like, yeah, Jesus. I'm sure. She thought it was creepy, but it seems like none of them felt he was that threatening, I guess. With a little digging, detectives found Sebastian/Frenchie's real name was Raymond Cormier, a middle-aged white man with long graying hair, a mustache, and a goatee. He was born in 1962 and had been convicted and imprisoned many times for violent offenses. He had 92 convictions to his name. A man in prison named Ernest DeWolf called detectives and said that he believed an acquaintance named Raymond Cormier had something to do with Tina's death after seeing about it on the news. He said before being in jail, he hung out with them a few times and he knew Cormier was sexually interested in Tina and had actually told him he had sex with her, which the man was dubious about. But then he found everything to be far too coincidental and once he learned about her murder and he called the police. The morning that they arrested Cormier, he told them that they wouldn't arrest him on bullshit charges and also said that he had important info about Tina if they would just let him go. Like, that's how it worked. I'll give you some deets if you just let me go. He was adamant that he didn't kill Tina or even quote unquote have sex with her. I did not kill that girl. I didn't kill fucking nobody. I don't know what happened to that fucking little girl, he shouted. The detectives attempted to make him feel guilty, pointed out his incredible rage, asking him why he's filled with so much anger, and anytime they attempted to get him to mention or fess up about the stolen truck, he completely avoided it. So going off of that, O'Donovan thought that it must be significant in relation to the murder. He knew that in this case, he was going on instincts more than he had actual evidence, but he thought that there were too many red flags with Cormier to ignore. Still, O'Donovan and the rest of the detectives were incredibly frustrated by his unwillingness to cooperate or give them any little bit of information whatsoever. So Tina told her social worker that the man named Sebastian had sold her bike for some weed and that he was going to give her a new bike. So when was this that he had promised to give her this new bike? He never admitted to saying anything like that to the detectives. Had Tina arranged to see him again, and is this when he had killed her? Before he got rid of the truck he stole, which Tina called the police on him for, did he use it to take her body to the river? because he otherwise only had a bike. Although he didn't have the confession he needed to charge Cormier, O'Donovan was going to keep him as long as he could under surveillance, feeling the pressure of what he'd likely done. In consulting with the prosecutors, O'Donovan knew that the piddly warrants that he was holding Cormier on would only allow them to hold him for 7 to 10 days at the most, and he knew if they released him, it would be difficult to keep him under surveillance. But they had a lucky break when an investigator from another department reviewing security footage from various robberies ID'd Cormier as the perpetrator in a grocery store robbery where he stole a bunch of meat and then threatened the security guard with a screwdriver. The new charge was enough to hold him for months until his case was heard. So Cormier was transferred to Milner Ridge Correctional Center, and detectives had gotten a warrant to get a sample of his DNA. He was surprisingly friendly and complicit and gave his DNA willingly, even though he had to do it regardless. Mm-hmm. He told detectives he and Tina spent a lot of time together, and it would have been unsurprising if they found any of his formerly long hairs on her, but he guaranteed they would not find any sperm. Okay. Then he suddenly began talking about the once non-starter, which was the truck. He said, let's just say I was driving it. Would that mean I'd be charged with stealing it? The detectives were non-committal, not giving Cormier much to go off of. They later agreed that he was fishing for information, perhaps trying to see how much they had on him. They were bothered by his statement that they wouldn't find any semen on her, as they strongly believed that Cormier had a sexual relationship with her. So the confidence of that was perplexing to them. What exactly did it mean that he was so confident that they would not find sperm on him? And I agree, but I still don't really know. It was at this time that another girl was found in the river. This time a 16-year-old Indigenous girl was found, partially clothed and badly beaten, sexually assaulted, hanging onto life in a tributary that fed into the Red River. The girl miraculously survived, and the details of her assault were grisly. She had been out with friends on a typical Friday night, and 2 strangers had enticed her to walk away from the group down a secluded path under the Midtown Bridge. There they violently sexually assaulted her. Then she either was thrown in the river or went into the river to escape the men and ended up flailing in the water. She managed to swim back to the bank a little ways upstream and was confronted and beaten by her attackers yet again. Police made the decision to release the girl's name in a plea for information about the men that attacked her, which paid off when another woman who had experienced similar circumstances that very same night called them with information, and they were able to ID a young Indigenous man and a teenager as the ones responsible for the attacks. A few weeks into November, a Detective Sergeant Bailey came to O'Donovan saying that Cormier was saying he knows who killed Tina, which they had to listen to. There we go. Listen to, bullshit or not. On December 1st, he arrived at police headquarters, informed he was still a suspect in Tina's murder, but he could call a lawyer at any time, but he refused to, saying he was impatient to talk. He said that the last few days he shared his cell with a biker deeply embedded in Winnipeg's crystal meth subculture. He said, this guy told me he knows who the real killer is. It was the leader of a biker gang. He said, Cormier said he was so confident about the information that the man provided him that he was willing to wear a wire to record their conversations in his cell. He said Tina was killed because she ripped off a gang leader on a bad coke deal, reminding them that she was known for this kind of thing and owed other drug dealers money. He went on to say everyone at the house was sharing needles, and it was very possible that Tina had gotten his blood on her from that. What? Yeah, he was just trying to cover his ass. He was fishing for information on where they were at in their investigation, and when they wouldn't give him anything, he became angry and hostile. He mentioned a case in which a guy was found guilty of a more serious crime due to not fessing up to a smaller crime, clearly referencing the stolen truck, but still not willing to admit that he'd stolen it. I don't know if he was trying to say, listen, I'll tell you I stole the truck if you just give me a clearance on this. Yeah. Later that day, O'Donovan received the news that Cormier's DNA didn't match anything found on Tina or the duvet cover. They knew they had to come at it from a different angle. Multiple people had mentioned how Cormier used his own blankets, folding them up into neat piles, and oftentimes hanging them up on a fence to air out. They decided to show witnesses a picture of the duvet cover draped over a chair. The first person, Ida Beardy, who lived on Alexander Avenue and Frenchie had stayed in their backyard for a period of time in the tent, immediately identified the blanket as being Frenchie's, saying he got it at Value Village and that it was the exact kind of blanket that you can open up and put another blanket inside. If you remember the duvet cover, that's a duvet cover, first of all. So she immediately identified it as a duvet cover. And also in their investigation, they found that not only was it sold at Costco, but it was later sold at Value Village at a discounted rate. So it did seem very likely that that was the exact same blanket that Cormier had that Tina was buried in, which, I mean, I'm sure there's a possibility that could happen and he didn't kill her. Mm-hmm. But then what the hell are the chances of that? When they brought Ida's daughter Chantel in, she also immediately ID'd the blanket as being Sebastian's or Frenchie's, saying he had it here in the house. And they were just very adamant that was his blanket.
Still, this was just circumstantial evidence, and they knew that they needed more. They knew they needed to eliminate the African men from the rooming house, and so they brought them in for questioning. The two men seemed genuinely shocked to be charged and immediately offered up any and all details of their drug and sex-fueled lives, agreeing to submit DNA right away, which ultimately came back supporting their story that they played no part in Tina's murder. They also did not have a vehicle in which to transport her body to the river as it was. This left Cormier the sole suspect in the murder of Tina Fontaine. O'Donovan decided an undercover operation was the only way to get the evidence they needed to prove that Cormier killed Tina. He called it Operation Styx. They planned out where Cormier would be sent after his release from prison, having an undercover officer living beside him and another officer posing as his part-time girlfriend. Mm-hmm. 2 days after his release, he called detectives saying he wasn't going to leave town until he cleared his name about Tina, that he would be asking around to get information, was willing to undergo hypnosis to see if he could recall any information.
God damn, dude. Like, take it down about 35%.
So he was injecting himself into the police investigation, telling them he went and spent time at her memorial, pointing out alternative suspects that looked similar to himself. And these were all details a criminal profiler would focus on, making him look rather guilty.
Big time.
Mo, the undercover officer living next to Cormier, developed a relationship with him, having him accompany him running jobs here and there and integrating himself with Mo's boss and promising more work in the future. He attempted on many occasions to get Cormier talking about Tina, but he never really took the bait.
He told Mo he wanted to see a police report on Tina's murder to see what they had on him, because all he knew was that he may or may not have been in possession of a stolen truck, which may have been the means used to dispose of Tina's body, which he said to him, followed by a wink. And then this little gem. There's 3 rules in crime. Deny, deny, deny. Which is true, but are you not very suspicious in this case?
No kidding.
He constantly went into meth-fueled ramblings about murder and secrets and all sorts of things that sound damning, but detectives couldn't really do anything with that. They decided they needed one final production where they were going to send Cormier on a big job for Mo's boss, and once he had traveled to Whistler, Canada, they were going to say that the police had new evidence in Tina's murder and put the entire gang at risk, which put the entire gang at risk, pressuring him to confess to them what he had done. But Cormier proved to be smarter than police time and time again, unfortunately. In the middle of the big setup, as Mo's girlfriend, quote-unquote girlfriend, called in a panic, saying the cops showed up banging on the door to arrest Cormier for murder on new evidence that they had, that someone had spotted him in the stolen truck just before Tina's body was dumped in the river, Cormier started voicing suspicion of the boss, who they called Jay, saying, "Who are you? How far will the Winnipeg police go to get me to confess to something I didn't do?" He just fucking knew. He knew he was fake. He made a run for it, and eventually the police chased him down, arresting him. It was such a bungled situation. Like, they wanted him to fess up, he didn't, and then he ran, and then they still had to arrest him. They chased him down and arrested him for the murder of Tina Fontaine. In the interrogation room, the detectives knew that they only had 24 hours to get a confession from him before he was to be released. But with every question, he simply responded, "Fuck off," and O'Donovan began to call him the Crow. because he was just saying the same thing over and over. He requested from the senior prosecutors in Winnipeg if he could issue an arrest warrant without a confession. After some deliberation, he was told that in fact he could charge Cormier with second-degree murder. In the end, there was enough evidence to fill 34 large 3-ring binders that took over 9 months for prosecutors to go through. Cormier was kept in solitary confinement, where he continued with his paranoia and belief that the Crown was setting him up for murder to cover up involvement by the police, which I'm pretty sure was just the meth-addled ramblings of someone that had a guilty conscience. When the prosecution, or what the prosecution saw as ample evidence for a conviction, the defense felt that they had never seen so much material say so little. They believed that the detectives made a grave error early in the investigation in isolating Cormier as a suspect, and in doing so had excluded important leads that should have been looked into, such as Winnipeg's drug and gang underbelly. Then, 2 informants came forward with information they gleaned from Cormier while he awaited his trial. The first was a white man in his 40s who was serving out the end of a long sentence for the exploitation of teen girls. The Brandon Correctional Center intercepted a letter from him in which he had written Cormier about Tina's murder. He had been in the same isolation unit as Cormier for 2 weeks over the summer, and for a few hours a day they were allowed out in the common areas of the block where they were able to talk to each other through the cell doors. The man said Cormier eventually told him about his sexual relationship with Tina and how she had been angry with him and reported him for stealing a truck, and in that anger, he accidentally killed her by suffocating her. He said that he then put her in a duvet cover with rocks to weigh her down, but had obviously not used enough. The second informant was an Indigenous man in his 30s who had mentioned Cormier in a call to his sister. He said in August he had been across the way from him in his jail cell, and they had struck up some kind of acquaintance. He mentioned that he liked to choke girls from behind so that they would be more compliant. He then talked about injecting meth with Tina, and that he discovered she'd stolen some drugs from him, so he put a plastic bag over her head. In the end, the Crown would not let these 2 testimonies from these informants be used in court, as there was not enough evidence to prove that they were actually true. Anything but hearsay.
Jennifer Richardson, who worked with Winnipeg's Street Reach program for years before moving to Ontario, said drugs are actually often used to exploit youth. She said, in my experience, oftentimes adult males are luring children through the auspices of come to a party, but their intent is to sexually exploit them. They offer a great time, they offer drugs and alcohol, they offer a place to stay, they offer understanding, they offer love. But their intent, from cases I've investigated, is to exploit children, and that is to have sex with children.
Yeah, and like we saw that in the documentary about Epstein, and also in Franklin.
Yeah.
And the other one,
Matt Shepard.
Matt Shepard, but the other government thing, I don't even remember now.
Oh God, all of them. Jeez.
So the trial opened January 29th, 2018 in the Queen versus Raymond Joseph Cormier in central Winnipeg. He was charged with second-degree murder and the death of Tina Fontaine and pled not guilty. The final jury selection was ethnically diverse and comprised of 8 women and 4 men.
The government did not introduce any forensic evidence or eyewitnesses directly linking Cormier to Tina's death, and at the time of trial, the cause of death remained undetermined.
After interviewing a number of witnesses over multiple weeks, the Crown rested their case that Tina had either been smothered or drowned, and that Cormier's own words had ID'd him as the killer. The defense argued that the evidence was all circumstantial, and Cormier had no clear motive for killing the 15-year-old girl.
Cormier's lawyers argued without a determination on the cause of death, it could not be known for certain that Tina died as a result of an unlawful act, and Cormier should be acquitted on that argument alone. And he was found not guilty on February 22nd of 2018. In March of 2018, political activists Indigo Arscott held a rally outside Toronto City Hall to voice outrage in memory of Tina due to Cormier being found not guilty of the crime. In March of 2019, Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth Daphne Penrose released a report documenting Tina's life and the shortcomings of the agencies that were meant to protect her.
Kiwatanoe Okamakinak Grand Chief Sheila North eloquently summed up how the community felt This is not the outcome anyone wanted. The systems, everything that was involved in Tina's life have failed her. We've all failed her. If Raymond Cormier had not killed Tina, then someone else had taken her life, and the city needs to find out who's responsible. This is not the Canada I want to be a part of, she concluded. Following the outcome of the trial, processions marched through the city demanding justice, but also in a sense of celebration and love for the communities coming together for this purpose. They knew it was just the beginning of a long, hard fight for justice for the Indigenous people in their community and all of Canada, one that is still being fought to this day.
Because of Tina's death, the Canadian Human Rights Commission then requested a full investigation into the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. In 2016, the new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, announced that a national inquiry titled Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls would be undertaken. 5 independent commissioners were appointed, and commissioners and staff began to consult with families, activist organizations, and others about how to structure the inquiry. As an additional response, the volunteer group Drag the Red was formed. Drag the Red has begun to regularly drag portions of the Red River in order to find bodies or evidence.
Man, that's morbid to think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. A local Inuit woman, Holly Jarrett, has started the social media campaigns #AmINext, which called for a national inquiry and allowed Indigenous women to express their feelings about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and a Change.org petition in response to Tina's death. The Strong-Hearted Buffalo Women Crisis Stabilization Unit, a semi-secure crisis intervention program for Indigenous girls considered at risk of sexual exploitation, was created in the fall of 2015 in response to Tina's case as well. The Nadinaway Agency also received funding to open 24/7 Safe Space for Youth, which was launched in November of 2018 as Tina's Safe Haven. Tina's body was buried on Siking First Nation next to her father. A memorial was placed at the site on the first anniversary of the discovery of her body at the Red River. And on February 28th of 2018, the Justice for Our Stolen Children camp was set up on Wascana Park in Regina in response to the death of Tina Fontaine and Colton Boucher,
who was another Indigenous teen that was found murdered during this investigation. It would be the last case for Sergeant John O'Donovan, who would leave the homicide unit a month after the verdict. At the end of the year, he retired from the Winnipeg Police Department altogether, and he sternly believed that they did not single-handedly focus on the wrong suspect and that they were open to all the suspects, but that the evidence clearly pointed to Cormier the whole time. So he said, he felt they did all they could do, and he wasn't regretful about the way they conducted the investigation. Tina's case was instrumental in the establishment of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which in 2019 found that the country was complicit in race-based genocide against Indigenous women, blaming the crisis on deep-rooted colonialism and state inaction, urging immediate action on over 200 individual cases. There are many grassroots organizations that are working to enact change in Canada and elsewhere, and we'll list some of those in the show notes if you would like to donate to the cause. And that is where we end this story of Tina Fontaine. To be honest with you, when I said we were going to do this episode, I thought that her killer had been caught. And after reading, I was like, well, fuck me. I'm so glad that this motherfucker clearly did some fucking shit. Like, I didn't even include in the notes so many of the things that they caught on the surveillance where he just like randomly would say, they're not going to get me for this murder, and then drift off into some other rambling. Like, and he talked to these girls. He brought young girls over to his place all the time. He was always randomly drug-addled saying something about Tina. Always. He was like obsessed with her.
He was. And even in his, I don't think I included it in the show notes, but he did like an interview after the trial, where people were like, he was like obsessively talking about her. Nobody would be talking about her, and then all of a sudden he would bring her up.
He would relate all sorts of things to her.
Yeah.
He was very clearly what a criminal profiler would say. He's guilty. And like his new girlfriend, which I didn't even mention, his new girlfriend looked exactly like her, but was of age. There were just all sorts of little things that are just, and he was constantly talking about, just constantly talking about her.
Yeah.
He was obsessed, and he would just say things like, I wish that she would have just not lied to me about her age, and like all this stuff just like randomly burst out in this. So he clearly did something. I really do not think that it is possible that he did not kill her. I do think that the investigation, unfortunately, the case against him didn't prove that he had killed her, which is what they needed to do.
Right.
And that's the case in so many frustrating cases where clearly this person is guilty, but as far as like legally standing, you can't just say, well, you seem real guilty and we know you did it, but we don't have the evidence, because that just ruins everything as far as justice is concerned.
Correct.
As though it's not already
ruined,
muddled and mucked up as it is. But anyway, this was not a very fun episode.
No.
So I know it's a hard one. It's a very heavy episode, but and that's part of the reason why, like years ago, whenever I started covering these, I was like, I'm going to do one once a month. And then I was like, I can't do it. But you just have to swallow the nasty jagged pill to reference back a couple episodes ago, or the Patreon. But it's something that's super important. There's obviously so many things that are important, but next episode is not going to be.
No.
Next episode is going to be a lighter episode, because I need we need a mental break. Yeah. Anyway, so thanks for listening. We love you.
Yeah. If you want to be, I mentioned it in the beginning of the episode, but if you want to be a part of our Patreon, head on over to patreon.com/creepitrealpod.
To make up for a little absence that we taken on there, just a slight absence, all of our patrons are going to get just the sweetest Christmas gifts. So don't worry.
We love you.
Yeah, we love you. Have a great life.
Have a great everything.
Creep it real.